Hey friends, thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation Dick and I had about the 2025 Japanese, Bahraini, Saudi Arabian, and US Miami Grand Prix. Oscar's dominating, Lewis is struggling. Are we witnessing the rebirth of Williams? As you'll hear, Dick and I share our individual takeaways for the teams and drivers out of our usual order. I think it'll make sense as the conversation unfolds. But before we get to our conversation, I need to ask, can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Okay, Dick, it is now time for our April monthly race review. We're actually going to capture one race that's happened here in May, just because of timing wise. But can you believe we've had this many races and so much information to cover and had very, very busy personal lives, day jobs that have been calling? It feels like oh, yeah, right? Like so much. But then as we talked about before we got onto this recording, we love this sport. We love this time together. So my hope is that even if we are going to go at kind of a high pace, our audience will realize it's just us being fans wanting to still make sure we get to do this because it is a reprieve from the rest of our very busy lives.
Right. There's nothing like a good benchmarking scenario or a time spent benchmarking. Maybe that's the better way to put it, to kind of put the rest of the day behind you, so to speak. So
That's right.
I was looking
That's
forward
right.
to this.
Yes, likewise. So let's get straight to it. We're going to start with the Japan Grand Prix. You
Mm.
know that I was looking forward to this. I was
Yep.
super excited, and then it didn't quite go the way that I thought it was going to go. But
Mm-mm.
still, highlight for me, I would say, of that race was not only Max's pole winning lap, but his race. And I said this in my race notes that he got out of turn 1 and really never looked back. It felt like we were watching 2023 and the first part of 24. I mean, he angled his car into that inside line and then just executed beautifully. And from that point on, with what we know now about the importance of clean air for this year's cars, especially, he just got
Yep.
into that relaxed state and just that rhythm and proved yet again how much of a generational talent he is, because the car isn't really where they want it to be, but he was able to wrestle it to what he wanted it to be. And then all I kept thinking was during that race, what would Max be like in the McLaren? And would he be able to extract even more because of some of the data I had seen about the quali lap gaps? And I kept thinking that would have been even more interesting. But he just really, I'm just always impressed by him. I'm not necessarily like a fangirl, but I've never been a Max detractor. But
Right.
that race, wow, it was just amazing. All right. What
Yeah.
about you?
Well, I think his whole weekend, I would put it down as at this stage in his career is probably one of his top 3 race weekends, because it's like you said, he executed perfectly throughout the weekend. And that pole lap was something else. It was not as dramatic looking as, say, Senna's pole lap in, I don't know, 88 or 89, whatever it was. But the other side of it is that in today's cars, which are so good, even then, how can I say this? There's a lot of times when those guys are really moving and they're setting track records and all that, and the cars are so planted that just doesn't look that exceptional, yet they are going really, really fast. This was one of those laps where not only did Max go fast, it looked fast. And that's
Yeah.
really saying something. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing you say is the skill of the racer sometimes belies how difficult technically the car is
yeah,
and how hard they are working to make it look so simple, and someone like him, he does that so effortlessly, so you don't really realize it, but at this race it really showed how hard it is, and
Yeah.
he showed his ability to harness that. Is that a good
Yeah.
way of restating what you said?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the things that I've really picked up here lately, and I'm sure that if I went back and looked at onboard video from 2 or 3 years ago, it would be the same thing. But you look at all these guys, Max, Fernando, Charles, whoever, Lewis, they're going down a long straightaway and they're sitting over there dialing something on their steering wheel. They're going that fast, and yet they're so plugged in that the world around them is in slow motion, and they actually have time to sit down and say, "Oh, I'm going to dial in a little bit more or a little bit differential for this next corner so that I can optimize the car for this particular corner at the end of that straightaway." And when you think about that, how fast they're going, and they actually are that relaxed and that plugged in that they can make an adjustment on the steering wheel with the right knob, taking the knob to the place where they want it to go. That's incredible.
I totally agree with you, and I think that that's such an important aspect to highlight of the skill of these drivers. Okay,
Yep.
so then let's move to Bahrain. For me, oh, actually, hold on a second. Let me step back. You didn't get to tell us your highlight from Japan.
I think it really is, it's what my highlight is your highlight, quite
Oh,
frankly.
okay.
I mean, I was super, super impressed with what Max did. I'm not like this crazy Max fan, but I'd be the first to say the guy is a generational talent, no question
Mhm.
about it. And he is taking that Red Bull, which is not the best car by any stretch, and he's just taking it by the scruff of the neck and just ringing it, man. That's all there is to it. It's impressive.
Okay. All right. So then let's move on to the Bahrain Grand Prix. For me, I would say it was actually George's performance. I said this in the race notes that it actually made me go back to our Ross Bentley interview where he talked about who he's most impressed with, and he talked about George. And I then watched how George handled so many of the reliability issues that the car had during this race, and how he just adapted. He stayed calm, and then it just felt like what I think I even said this in the race notes, like a bygone era of Formula One, which you guys have talked about, of where reliability was actually a questionable thing for cars every time
Right,
you were taking them onto the track, and how the
right.
drivers had to be a different preparation, I guess, mentally and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
adaptability. And you watch that in George, that he didn't let it destroy his race. And instead, I think he harnessed the reliability issues to his advantage. And so for me, I would say that was the race, or that was the highlight of the race.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, and it's funny because I wasn't going to talk about George right here, but let's do it anyway because I think you bring out a great point. George, this whole year, is out from under Lewis's shadow finally, right? I'm sure he feels like the word finally is the way he would define it. And he's been sneaky fast and sneaky consistent. He's not necessarily there, but he's thereabouts. And so as a result, he's just clicking away, grabbing podiums, grabbing top fives, scoring points, just getting it done with a car that at some tracks is really good. And, at other tracks, that Mercedes, I think you could argue, is sort of best of the rest, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. And I'm since we're going to talk about George, we could talk about this piece too. I keep thinking about his development as a driver when we watched him at Williams,
Hmm.
and how he matured there. And then many questioned if it was appropriate to bring him in to Mercedes. But I think that it shows that the racing development efforts that Mercedes is doing, and I think when we get onto Kimi, we can talk about that in more depth there. But the Mercedes style of choosing and developing drivers may
Hmm.
be a little bit different than what we see elsewhere, but it's showing that
Hmm.
it holds water. And going to your point of now him being out from under, him being George, being out from under Lewis's shadow, and I do think he feels that way, he's now
Yep.
being unleashed, and he's putting himself like consistently. where if the cards are played properly, like if a variable throws in, he's there. He's showing up on the podium. And
Yeah.
that I think is kind of amazing. I don't know that people would have thought when he made that transition from Williams. And this is something we've talked about in other conversations, how it's hard to sometimes distinguish, is it the car or is it the driver that's having the challenge, or is it the matchup that's incorrect? You know, like the driver may have capacity, but the car is not meeting the driver's
Yeah.
potential, or
Yeah.
the car is exceeding the driver's ability and they're just not in the right car for them. You know, like this is as much as they can do. And I think that we're seeing a good combo. I do think when we get to Mercedes, we can talk about it a little bit more. Is Mercedes, like, where are they in their own development process? But going back to the
Right.
highlight, this was the highlight for me of that race.
Yeah.
Do you have anything
Yeah.
different, or you want to move on to Saudi Arabia?
Well, I just think the one thing that I would add, I mean, I'm totally in agreement with you, but also the temperatures at both Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. It was kind of funny because it's like free practice one and free practice three was run in the heat of the day. Free practice two and qualifying were run at night, which would be the simulation for the race circumstances, right? It's almost like I was sitting there looking at it and hearing about the heat and all that kind of stuff, and I was asking myself, what was the real point? Because the tire dag would be different, the aero settings would be different, other than figuring out kind of, getting familiar with the track again and how it's changed from last year. Man, what did they learn? I don't know. It'd be interesting to, ask our buddy Jack Crawford about that sometime.
Yes, which is perfect segue to Saudi Arabia, which was twofold for me. And since we've brought up Jack, I'll give him the prop before I talk about the
I planned
Formula
that
One aspect.
segue.
You did so well. So if people haven't taken time to watch Jack Crawford's performance at Saudi Arabia for
In the
F2,
F2, yep,
yes, they need to do that. And
yep,
especially when you consider that F2 didn't get to finish their racing in Australia, and then some of the things that's happened in the intervening races, the resilience and grit of Jack in his performance, especially for his quali lap for the feature race, was just beautiful.
yep,
And as Americans, we should be cheering on Jack as he's trying to make this effort successful. And so I was really glad that I had taken the time, which, I try to watch the F2 races and the F3 races, and, it makes it for very long weekends, but totally worth it to cheer on these young drivers who are going and pursuing the dream of trying to be on the Formula One grid. So that's the first one. Talking about the Formula One race, I would say the championship, in my mind, Saudi Arabia solidified that the championship fight is on, and that who gets that pole and who leads into that first corner is what's going to make the difference in every race moving forward, because the margins are so tight. And so I just got really excited watching the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, because I kept thinking, oh, if this continues as what I believe it will, the year is going to have some really interesting back and forths of who's going to be leading this week and who's going to be leading next week in the championships, both driver
right.
and team. Okay, so that's my thoughts and highlights. What about you? Response or other highlights?
So, a number of things. Number one, totally agree with you that the championship is on. I mean, Oscar, let's face it, he's, counting Miami, he's won three in a row. But I think that there's been some extenuating circumstances, and certainly I think Max is showing that he's in the fight. I think Lando is definitely in the fight. He's had a couple of qualifying performances slash misfortunes that are somewhat masking the potential there, because I think most of the races will show that Lando has had some bad luck slash misfortune, but he has been really quick in the races. And I think that if he can, stay out of trouble in qualifying, which has seemed to be his Achilles heel right now, and qualify even or a little bit ahead of his teammate, which he did in Miami, then he becomes a problem, right? I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with the championship. For my highlights, certainly number one, Jack's effort over the weekend was amazing. And I look forward to seeing what he does the next time they hit the track. I think it's in at Imola here in a couple of weeks. For those of you who haven't listened to our interview with Jack, and there's another one that will be coming out here pretty soon, he is a remarkable young man. Really proud of him. Not only an American, he's a Texan. So and he's from my hometown. So I'm even more excited and proud of what he's doing. And I'm really, really hoping that he gets a shot for that second seat at Cadillac. Either him or Colton Herta, either one. I know Colton and I like Colton, but he may be happier being an IndyCar driver. I don't know. But either one of them, I'm really hoping will make it into that second seat at Cadillac. So anyway, that's part of my highlights. The other one is speaking as a driver, Saudi Arabia, that track is absolutely breathtaking. It is so fast, and there's walls everywhere just waiting to bite you. I mean, it's like Monaco at twice the speed, and which almost literally is the case. There were several times where it was just sort of like I had to watch, but I wanted to look away because they were coming so close to just writing a car off, and maybe doing some real physical damage. It was that track requires not only an amazing amount of skill, but just incredible bravery.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. As a non-racer, I'm glad you brought that up. Okay, so let's move on to our Miami highlights.
Yeah.
So for me, I think the action on the track, what during that first stint, and what I presume to be a lot of hunger amongst the drivers to make sure that they maximized the time early because of this unusual variable of rain coming in.
Hmm.
And it seemed like they wanted to make sure that they were positioned very well to maximize their track position. And so there were different efforts, and I think that's why we saw the increase of the overtakes, and I feel like than we have historically. Plus, I just feel like this year's Miami race, maybe it's as you said a few years ago that it would take a little bit of time for the race to kind of have
Hmm.
time on the calendar before we started to see the true viability. I actually this year went, oh, it's not a snooze fest because I feel like the last 2 years I fell asleep during the race because it was such a
Hmm.
processional.
Hmm.
And this year my attention was there. I felt like the drivers also, maybe it's where I feel like this is maybe a different week than it normally has been. It just felt like the drivers were more settled into the race and into their cars than maybe historically they have. And so they were willing to take those risks. And I think that that's part of the reason that I don't want to say anxiety, but that knowing of that looming rain, I wonder if that's what led to some of those very colorful radio commentaries that we ended up hearing about because
Yep.
the drivers were wanting to be very assertive in knowing that not only was the race on the line, but maybe things inside the team, their position as the number one driver or any of the decisions that are going to need to be made about the team's development efforts. Because, like, when I started looking at the calendar, I started thinking, okay, how many more weeks do they have before what we all know is the flexi wing stuff happens in Barcelona? And also at that point in the season, how much more development are they really going to want to put on any further? And so working back from that, I kept thinking this might be, or maybe Imola, where you have to make the decision of whose input and feedback is going to lead the driver or the team development efforts. And so maybe the drivers also felt that kind of behind the scenes, I need to put my stamp on this race. I don't know. Maybe I'm overthinking it, and you can tell me I am.
I think a season has ebbs and flows. And I think that while teammates have to work with each other to a certain degree, I think that there's also, kind of what you hinted at, where everybody is looking after their own self-interest, right? And asserting themselves. I think when it comes to car development, because the regs are changing at the end of the year, the last race of the season, this particular car concept goes away and we get an all new car concept. And so I think for all the teams, they have to make a decision of, okay, when do I quit developing the car? And, you make a great point. This whole flexi wing thing, Barcelona, that's 2 races away. What's that going to do to a team like McLaren, right? Who's got such a dominant car, it's working really, really well as compared to a Williams or an Aston Martin or a Racing Bulls, right? Is this where they gain or is it not? And when do they quit developing the 2025 car? Because all of them are going to have to come up with a wing that's compliant to this new reg. But what's the knock-on effect? Okay, we're changing the nose of the car. Now, what's going to happen to the rest of the car, right? With the airflow when
Right.
that wing changes. And so, do you then make the decision where you say, okay, I've got X million dollars of money in development money. I have X million dollars potentially on the line based on where we finish in the Constructors' Championship. What's my risk reward? Team principals are doing that calculation right now mentally. I guarantee you.
Yeah, I think so. And it only makes sense because as you said, there's millions of dollars on the line here. Do
Oh,
you
yeah.
want do you want to share any of your highlights or do you want to move
Well,
on to development?
I thought the opening stint really pretty much sealed the deal for who was going to wind up winning the race. Verstappen got out there, some really hard racing between him and Oscar for Oscar to get around him. Lando, of course, got pushed off at the start, had to fight his way back, spent quite a bit of time getting around Max, finally did. And when he did, he immediately started walking away from him. But by then, for all practical purposes, the race was over. Oscar just needed to maintain the gap back to Lando, which he did a very good job of, and that was that. But having said that, the first stint was pretty awesome. The other thing that I would say is because of the crazy weather that they had for the sprint race, starts off wet, finishes up dry. When do we take the intermediates off and put the slicks on and all that kind of stuff? It actually jumbled up the order quite a bit. And I was really glad to see the, rain once again being the great equalizer. My boy Fernando Alonso got up to, I think, fourth or something like that, and was looking to score some pretty decent points until, Liam Lawson went and drove into the side of him. So that
Yeah.
was hugely disappointing. And I think it's amazing that Lawson and Fernando seem to keep finding each other on the track. And I'm like, what's up with that? But anyway, that was disappointing as a Fernando fan. Here's the other thing. We're 6 races into the season, I think, quarter of the way through. Alonso hasn't scored a point yet. That's nuts.
Yeah. I have to say, when I saw that happen, I thought of you and I went, oh, that's awful for Dick. He's
Oh, yeah.
really going to be feeling this. And I agree with you. I was watching Fernando's race and going, okay, this is going to be it. It's going to break the situation. It's going to set him up really well. And then I went, how did this happen? How did he run into the car? I'm
Yeah,
still trying to understand that. But kudos to Fernando. He just continues to show the grit in which when we get to the Aston Martin conversation, I want to hear your response to my thoughts. So
sure.
on that note, can we move on to development?
Sure.
Okay. So here's what I would say overall about what I think the lesson I've learned so far about where development is that McLaren is this season's dominant car. That's what I
Right.
had in my notes until I heard you say what you said about the changes and the cost benefit analysis that team principals are going to be doing post Barcelona or in response to the Barcelona Flexi Wing. And now I wonder, would we see a slight change? I would think not. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think that some may take a really big gamble or they may not? They'd say we'd rather just make the incremental because we know that really our eye is on 26.
Unless McLaren's new front wing is a complete disaster and they've got to go and try something else, maybe all of a sudden, pick a team, Mercedes, they get it right. All of a sudden, suddenly they've got the world beater car because of this regulation change in the middle of the season. That's entirely possible that that could happen. And then Zach Brown's going to have to sit down and say, okay, we've got this much of a lead in the Constructors' Championship. We've got this much development money, and we have this much money that we potentially could win. How do I go about that? If the new front wing doesn't disturb the airflow going to the back of the car, then you would expect that McLaren would remain the dominant car. That's not a given, but that's what you would expect, right? And so I think it's almost like they have to play wait and see. But on the other hand, that's if you're Zach Brown or Toto Wolff or Christian Horner or Fred Vasseur. But then you have other teams. Let's say you're Aston Martin. You need to make really sure that that brand new shiny wind tunnel that you've got correlates with what you're seeing on the track. So, to a certain degree, they have to prove two things. And that is one, they've got to go in and prove that they can correlate on track performance with the wind tunnel. And then they have to prove to themselves that they can develop a car mid-season, right? The teams like McLaren and Mercedes and Red Bull, they know how to develop their car. And so if they get their numbers right and all that, McLaren's got a relatively new wind tunnel, Red Bull does not. So I think that that's the calculus that's going to be run through the heads of the team principals, depending on where they are in the pecking order and depending on what they see after that new wing comes out that's forced on them. I don't think they can really make a decision. I think that they're going to have three or four options to choose from based on what they see on the track once they're able to actually put that wing into a race condition. Long
Okay. So
answer.
no,
Long answer, I
I
realize.
love the long answer. I'm glad you gave it, and I'm actually going to ask you to make it a bit longer, which is you
No.
got us to Aston. Now tell me what you think the TPs for the rest of the grid, the back of the grid, who don't have nearly as much money, may not
Hmm.
have a new wind tunnel, or maybe they have some elements that are great that they feel like infrastructure wise. Their margin for error is much more narrow,
Oh, yeah.
right? Like what would you think would be going through their heads?
I think if you're like Sauber, those guys are improving, right? They're proving that they can improve their car, but they've got to get ready since Audi is coming in and taking over next year, right? We all know that. And so I think that they're going to continue learning how to develop. I think Racing Bulls probably to a lesser extent. I think teams like Alpine and Williams, they're sort of like 5A and 5B in my mind. And so I think that they're kind of in the never, never land or no man's land of I really need to be thinking about the 2026 car and I want to do that. And yet I'm tantalizingly close to the top four. Do I go in and try to disrupt that? And I think they're going to opt to worry about the 2026 car, quite frankly, at some stage where they just say, look, the top four, just too much. We can't beat them this year. We've got to come back stronger next year at the beginning. But you know that they've got to be looking at that and saying, could we knock off Ferrari? Well, maybe, you know. And how much money does that mean if you make the jump from fifth to fourth in the constructors championship? What's that worth?
Right. You're also expecting that with the change, the top four stay relatively stable, that they're going to get it right. And you're
Hmm.
hoping that you're going to get it right if you take this major gamble, right? Yeah,
Right.
that's a
Right.
lot of concentration and thinking
Uh-huh.
and ability to say how much confidence do you have in your team, what you've already built. Because it also, if you roll the dice and you're wrong, the stakes are so high, not only the financials, but even like I guess I'm thinking of a team like Haas, I'm thinking of a team like Williams,
Right.
where they've been trying to build not just infrastructure, but a new team culture. You don't want to lose that, which
Right.
you've worked so hard on such a high gamble. But then the stakes are so high. And if you
Well,
did do it, can you imagine how exponentially that would help your team?
exactly.
You know? Oh, wow. That's a lot to, yeah,
Yeah.
that's why they're team principals, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Because I mean, like in the case of Haas, pretty sure they use Ferrari's wind tunnel, which, now that they've gotten rid of their correlation issues, that wind tunnel is probably a really good wind tunnel. Whereas Williams, we know that they've suffered for, a decade of underinvestment. And so their wind tunnel probably isn't all that great. So if you're Val's, you're sitting there thinking to yourself, do I really want to go and roll the dice? But dadgum, we've gotten really close so far, you know? And Williams has always had a culture of being a little bit of a giant killer anyway. So, you know, if he carries that kind of mindset forward, oh, he may go for it, you know? I don't think he will, but because he seems to be the guy that's going to play the percentages more than others might. It'll be interesting to see what they do, for sure.
Well, and you also have two drivers that I think are technically, what is the word? Technologically astute, right?
Yep.
And they understand.
Yep.
So could that be your gap filler for a not so great wind tunnel? And if you have a good rapport, they're showing like their feedback is giving you good information, just as not maybe just as good, but in a different variation of what you get from the wind tunnel. Maybe you say, I'll rely more on the data from my drivers than I will the wind tunnel. Maybe that's part of the reason they've been successful is that we
Yeah.
haven't heard anything that they've upgraded the wind tunnel, but they have made enough changes and are listening to their drivers that must be making the difference. I mean, because that's the main change.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, Williams was starting to look pretty good towards the end of last year, and you know, Carlos comes in and brings all that knowledge from his years at Ferrari, and lo and
Hmm.
behold, here we are, you know, and I mean, Williams is they're going to be a headache if they keep developing themselves like they are.
Mhm.
They're going to be a headache for a lot of teams.
Yeah, I think so. Well, that's a fantastic segue to our discussion of the teams. I didn't
Hmm.
have Williams at the top of the list, but let's just go out of my order because, it's just
Sure.
my order. And let's
Yeah,
talk about
yeah.
Williams a little bit more in that I think that the team and the duo of Carlos and Alex, it really makes me believe that Williams could be a sleeper for 26 for the
Yep.
front of the pack.
Yep.
And I wrote in my notes, like, what a story that would be. And I do
Hmm.
think the team is working on 25, but really focused on 26. I listened to an interview and it sounded like they're really trying to straddle that fence very delicately. Almost seems like it's race by race, day by day, that they're making those decisions and that they have made some major systemic changes, which is why we're seeing that modernization and, if anything, the
Hmm.
optimizing of their work and their culture. And then I
Yep.
think that bringing in someone like Carlos, who not only you highlighted the Ferrari, and in my head I was thinking, but he also has all those other teams that he's been with.
True.
And so he
True.
has all that experience of seeing how others have done this up. Granted, like the McLaren was a few years ago, but at least he understands their culture and knows how they think. And then you
Yep.
bring in his racing talent and his racing pedigree. That's combined with Alex's resilience and strength. I think it really positions them to maintain that height that I think that they're getting if they can now just navigate this, as we've said, the regulations change that are being foisted upon them. They could really be something next
Yep.
year.
I think that the future at Williams looks very bright, quite frankly. And I'm excited for him. I've always been kind of a Williams fan anyway, from way, way, way back in the, you know, late 70s, early 80s. You know, I've always liked that team. And so to see them come back makes me happy.
Okay, so then another team that I am feeling like will be a bit of a sleeper is Haas. I
Hmm.
think that for me, I listened to an interview that Esteban Ocon did. I can't remember who it was right now, but I feel like we're seeing a different side of him inside the Haas world, and one that I don't think we've seen before. And I actually like it. And I'm
Right.
wondering if some of it is because of the history that he has with Ayo Komatsu. And from what I understand, Ayo was the race engineer for him when he did his very first F1 testing, if I remember the story correctly. And they developed
Oh.
a very personal relationship as a result of that testing that he did. And so I'm just wondering if, with all the effort that IO is doing of the Haas culture, bringing in Esteban, and then what we also know of Ollie, is that
Hmm.
going to be just the right synergy of what Haas is needed? Like, because I really think that IO is a exemplary team principal,
I
and I
agree.
can't wait to see that like trajectory that they're on. And so I'm just like, man, that team culture that they're not trying to reinvigorate like what you've highlighted of Williams. Like I see this as they're trying to build it because they're
Right.
still the young team. And that memory and that heart for them is a variation on the very thing that we said Williams have and of trying to see how high they can go, where Williams is that historic team and Haas is that newer team. So I'm like excited to see could they figure out that pathway to be the
Hmm.
winners that we want to
Right.
see them in this modern era.
Yeah. No, I think it could be very interesting. And of course, they go about their racing very differently, right? Delara builds the car for them, for example, and they've got the technical partnership with Ferrari. So they are in a very different position than any of the other teams out there. A little bit of a compromise, but that also probably helps them to control their costs a little bit better, maybe. But I think what's interesting is like at Miami, Esteban was flying. He really did well this past weekend. And Ollie, on the other hand, he kind of struggled. But overall, I think it's pretty clear that Haas has taken a step forward, but their car seems to be circuit specific a bit. So it'll be interesting to see how this rest of the season goes as they go from track to track. But clearly, the Haas like those long straightaways at Miami. That's for sure.
Yeah, that's a good point that it could be very much a track specific. I'm also glad you brought up the Dallara and Ferrari partnerships. That's a good point too, because
Hmm.
it highlights the differential, I think, that sometimes can go under the radar when we're thinking about what are the
Right.
components that's needing to be managed in
Right.
building the car and maintaining the car and developing the car. So that's really good.
Yep.
Okay, so then let's go to Aston Martin. And I'm
Uh,
kind of going to, I know, right? It
uh,
feels not right. I guess
yep.
for me, I've relegated myself to the reality that 25 will just be brutal for Aston Martin. I
Yeah.
just don't see how it can be otherwise. I literally wrote in my note, I kind of feel like Leia when she says to Obi-Wan in her iconic quote, "This is our most desperate hour. Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope." And I feel like
Yeah, exactly.
right? I feel like everybody at Aston and myself as a fan would say this. This is our most desperate hour. Help me, Adrian Newey. You're my only hope. You know, like 2025 seems to be just like about data gathering. And I feel like I heard an interview where they said that's probably how they're approaching it. But trudging through and then knowing that they're confirming, as you highlighted earlier, the wind tunnel and all the infrastructure investment that they've built is actually going to provide them with the best data. And then you bring in an Adrian Newey, you have a racing champion like Fernando Alonso. It just seems like you just have to push through the pain right now of 25 to get to 26. I don't know.
Hmm.
18 more races, right? I think is the math of
Yep.
pain is really hard to just exude sadness when you think about Aston and the whole team and what they're having to go through because they have to still bring 100% every week, every day for every weekend. And that's got to be grueling. And I feel a lot of empathy for them on that
Yep.
front.
Obviously, I'm a Fernando fan, and my son Derek, who comes on our podcast every now and then, is a massive Fernando fan. And let me tell you what, Derek inevitably comes over to the house to watch the races with me, and it's just not fun because
Aw,
he suffers so much because his boy had such a horrible car. And the hilarious part is that that car is actually way better than last year's car. The problem is everybody else has gotten even better than they did. You
that's a
know,
good
there's
point.
and there's rumors that, they know what the problem is and that there's a big upgrade coming for Imola. That remains to be seen. They had a big package come out at Imola last year. It wasn't an upgrade, it was a downgrade. And we're very skeptical until we see it. But there are, I don't think they're rumors, but people have been quoted who supposedly know. People have been quoted as saying, yeah, the correlation with the wind tunnel with what we're seeing on the track is very good. We know where our problems are. We're making parts to fix that. but we're going to be very thoughtful and careful about when we introduce an upgrade package because we don't want to go backwards. So I like that. The other piece is that for 2026, the rumor has it that Honda has a very good power unit for the Aston Martin. And with Adrian
Hmm.
Newey designing the car and a good Honda engine, maybe 2026 might be Fernando's year. It's like the man clearly has not forgotten how to drive. Do you know that he had like the first or second best reaction time at the start of the Miami Grand Prix or something like that? And so, I mean, he was like one of the really fastest guys off the line. So time has not slowed him down, clearly. And with Newey drawing a good car and Honda providing a really strong engine, who knows? He may suddenly, look like the old Fernando again. That would be amazing.
Yeah, that's exciting. And you'll just have to keep telling me that every time we do a race review,
Yep.
that the Honda engine, which has promise, coupled with Adrian Newey, may be our Obi-Wan that we've been waiting for. Like that's the Luke Skywalker and Obi showing up.
Yep.
So let's see. Oh, my heart. Okay,
I
let's go
know.
to another one, which makes my heart a little sad. And then we'll get to the ones that have been exciting, which is Kick Sauber. I mean, the hearts and determination of these drivers, I think, is what moves me, but I don't understand the team. And all I can say is I feel like the drivers are truly giving their all. I feel like actually the team, like the actual team members, you watch
Yep.
them, you can see they're working hard. I just don't
Yep.
understand the leadership and what's going on and
Yeah.
why the car isn't performing better. But I think you said it earlier, it is doing better relative to where it was.
Right.
But yeah, when everybody else is way ahead of you, it's just, I just hope that the team doesn't lose heart and that
Yeah.
there is a plan. I feel like I say that every time we talk about this team.
Yeah, and let me add one other thing though. I gotta hand it to Bortoleto. Of all the rookie drivers, save maybe Ollie Behrman, this guy has the best situation possible. He's on a team where nobody has any expectations whatsoever. So really, all he has to do is figure out how do I compare with Nico Hulkenberg, who's no slouch. And in case of Ollie, he's got to show well against Esteban. But nobody's expecting anything from either of these teams. And yet, those two rookies, especially Bortoleto, because Ollie's got a little bit of a high profile going for him because he, replaced Carlos last year for the one race when Carlos had the emergency appendectomy and Ollie went out and shocked the world. I mean, that was a phenomenal performance. And he certainly has had an up and down season so far this year, but that kid's going to be good. Whereas with Bortoleto, he's flying under the radar. Nobody's looking at him because he drives for Sauber. And yet, you go and you look at what he's doing, that kid's doing a really good job.
Yeah.
So I'm really impressed with him. And it's no big surprise to a certain degree that somebody like Fernando Alonso is managing that kid because I'm sure he's already figured out, oh, yeah, this kid has got it. So it'd be interesting
Yeah,
to see.
I think you're right. I think it's a really valid point. So then on different rookie and moving on to the Racing Bulls, what are your thoughts about Isaac? I mean, I know for me, I'm
Yep.
becoming a fan of that kid. I really like him. I'm hoping that Laurent Mekies and the team are really continuing that investment in him. But I wonder what your thoughts are on him.
Oh, yeah, there's no question about it. I had never really heard of Isaac prior to 2025. I mean, I was aware of the name, but it pretty much ended there. I've been very impressed, and again, Racing Bulls, because of it being the junior team to Red Bull and all the chaos that was going on at Red Bull, there's a certain spotlight that's being put on Racing Bulls, so you're not able to just completely fly under the radar like you would be if you were driving for Kick Sauber, right? But having said that, Hadjar has pulled that car up into the top 10 more than once. I mean, he's making that car look really, really good. And I think it's probably a pretty decent car. He's been impressive, quite frankly.
I agree. I've been shocked every time I see his quality behavior and then also his ultimately his race performance as well.
Yep.
I
Yep.
yeah, and I just think he's a great kid. Liam, I will just put this note, but you don't have to respond if you don't want to, which is it's good to see how the team handled Liam's return. I
Yep.
appreciated they treated him with dignity and that I think both of these drivers, probably because of the culture of the Racing Bulls and race Red Bull environment, they realize that all of this could slip through their fingers and they're just doing their best and performing wherever possible. And I really
Yep.
respect that.
I agree. Liam is finding himself. I mean, I still don't understand driving into the side of Fernando, but okay. He is young and he is very aggressive. And, he's trying to make a name for himself, which I get it, but, he needs to somehow find a way to take the pressure off of himself.
Okay, so let's move to Mercedes.
Mm.
For me, this car is vying for the best of the rest, and that's not really what I think Mercedes really wants to be able to say. Like, but it is what it is,
Yeah.
and I hope they're getting ahead of their efforts on the 26 car. But as to the drivers, each race I come to love each of those Mercedes boys more. We've already talked about
Yep.
George.
Yep.
And I just find myself really loving young Kimi Antonelli. He's such
Yep.
an I put this like adorable, I have these air quotes here, kid achieving and growing. And I was very concerned last year at his Monza debut that this was too early for him and that this wasn't the right moment. I didn't question the talent. I just didn't know if he had the ability to make the jump. But he's showing he's got a lot of internal grit and determination that I can't help but cheer him on. He's also just like the lack of guile is what I feel like I see in him. And he just has like that kid brother kind of thing. And it makes my heart, maybe that's the girl in me,
Right.
just loves him. And and you know this, I watched the Netflix documentary, The Seat, and it
Yep.
only made me appreciate this kid more. And I'm just really glad that he's there and that he's in that Mercedes environment. And then we've already talked about Russell. So
Yep.
you can feel free to
Yep.
respond or move us on to Red Bull if you'd like.
I had my doubts about what Mercedes was doing after, Kimi crashed at Monza last year. Clearly, I was wrong. I mean, again, I never had any doubt about his talent. I had a doubt about his experience, but he's clearly a quick learner. He's quick anyway on the track and he's a quick learner. So that's going to serve him well. I look forward to seeing what he does. I mean, the kid is clearly a talent. As the season wears on, he's going to become more and more of a challenge to George. I think very soon he's going to match him in raw pace, probably, but George will probably beat him in racecraft based on experience. But, if those two remain teammates for another couple of years, probably takes a couple of years for Kimmy to get to fully where he needs to be. Ought to be real interesting. Mercedes got a strong driver lineup for sure.
Okay, so then Red Bull. Let's talk about this car. RB21 seems to be a little bit more.
Peaky.
Yeah, that's the right word, peaky. I like that. And it's unfortunate because you would want them to be able to get that car where they need it to be. And it
Yep.
goes back to just wreaking havoc over them. And especially, I think that as I watch this, it only reinforces to me how technological Formula One is. Like when you talk about the prowess that is happening inside the sport, that when you have such a great product, but then you just make these minor technological tweaks, or you have a challenge in your infrastructure that is so technologically dependent, how it can have this downstream effect on everything and dramatically tumble everything that you've been building. And I don't know that non-racers especially, but like non-fans of the sport may fully grasp these small incremental changes,
Right.
how it can impact this multi-billion dollar industry and these
Yep.
teams.
Yep.
So that was to me, and we've already talked about Max and his generational talent. The other thing I would say is Yuki is doing better than Liam.
Yep.
But
Yep.
I've been trying to rack my brain to go, and I'm glad that he's in the seat, so don't mishear me when I say this. I've been just racking my brain to go, but is he doing better than what Checo is doing? Or do we think that it's a different mental state than Checo was by the time of his
Right.
departure? And so
Yeah.
that may be easier for the team to manage in the second seat.
For sure. And as Yuki comes along, he's starting to score more points, which is going to be useful in the Constructors Championship. So I think as the season progresses, I would be pleasantly surprised if Yuki ever came out and said, "Oh yeah, I'm feeling really comfortable in this car." And his on-track performance demonstrates that level of comfort. I hope that's the case. But I think that car has historically been really tricky to drive. So if Yuki were able to say that and then back it up with his on-track performance, I think it'd be really great for the sport because it would be nice to have another Red Bull out there actually doing something other than running around in sort of, the bottom of the top 10.
I agree. So then, do you want to move on to McLaren?
Sure.
Okay. So we talked a little bit about it, and here's where I just keep trying to mentally prepare myself is that the battle between these two drivers is going to come to a head. I'm wondering if it's going to happen in Imola. If not, I'm thinking it's going to happen in Barcelona. I just feel like they're just watching their behavior, their performances. It just seems like the team will have to make that decision of who is the unofficial driver number one, even though they keep saying
Yeah.
that they don't have driver number one. And then as I sit and ponder about it in my free time, which we've already said I don't have a lot of, so this may not be a well thought out thought. I'm just wondering if this is a variation on what we saw at Red Bull between Daniel Ricciardo and Max Verstappen, in that you had someone who had been nurtured and a lot of weight put behind them, but then this talent comes in that wasn't expected and kind of starts to erode on that confidence. Because the reason I say this is Lando keeps talking about how the car doesn't suit him. I've heard him say that at least
Yep.
twice now. And I'm like, but that doesn't make any sense. As much as I respect you and believe in you, Lando, that doesn't make sense because the car should be suiting you because you've been there the longest and you've had the most feedback out of anybody. So it should be at least that's what my understanding as a non-racer.
Hmm.
I'm worried that it's the mental preparation that's not suiting him and that he's defeating himself before he gets into the car. And that's what needs to be addressed more than the car itself, because the car seems to be that once you get out there into that clean air, it's going to go. And it's about your on-track performance and strategy and reaction. Because there have been a couple of times, and I can't remember right now which race it was. I just was like, oh, Lando, don't do that right now. Just like hold steady. And then other times I'm like, Lando, just go do it. You can, take the risk
Yep.
right now. That's where I go, that's not the car. I don't think it's the car. I think it's you as the person who has like, I say this with all respect. So please don't hear me as like bashing Lando. I think he has the capacity to be there. I'm just
Yeah.
worried who's around him. So, in that sense, it's kind of what you've heard me say about Charles. Like I believe in him. I just want to see him meet that potential.
I think Lando has the pace to beat anybody. I think that at the end of the day, it's probably going to come down to making sure that you piece together and execute your weekend as close to flawlessly as possible. And right now, Oscar is leading the championship because Lando has not executed flawlessly. And Oscar has, while not flawless, he's made a couple of fewer mistakes that have paid off in a big way. The opening lap battle between Lando and Max, while fun to watch, cost Lando the race, as an example, in Miami. I think had Lando maybe found a way to not put himself in a position of being pushed off by Max, yeah, maybe he would have lost one position, but he wouldn't have lost like five. And that's a big difference, right? Of having of way more dirty air, way more wearing your tires out, trying to pass cars, all that other kind of stuff, right? Which would have put him in a much better position. And I think the roles probably would have been reversed where Lando led Oscar home. That would be my take on it. So that's what I'm trying to get at.
I think it's very
Yeah.
valid.
Yep.
Okay, so another driver who is struggling, which also is just hard for me to watch, is actually Lewis. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, he's still coming to grips with a car that I don't think he fully understands. And there were certainly some fairly chippy back and forth between Lewis and the pit wall in terms of let me pass Charles. And then later on, oh, let's, please let Charles repass you. And then Lewis came back and said, oh, do you want me to let the Carlos pass me as well? He's frustrated for sure. And, but I mean, he's a champion. That's going to happen. But I also believe it's going to come right for him and all will be forgiven. Winning is a great tonic, right?
Good
And
point.
right, and Lewis did not come to Ferrari to run sixth or seventh. So give it time. They'll gel.
I think you're right. And then on the other side of the garage, I would say is Charles is handling Lewis's arrival much better than I ever expected. So
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
actually gives me hope when it comes to people like Lando that if the mental preparation and mental health aspect of it can be taken into high priority, we know that they have the skill and talent because that's why they're there. And so it just needs to be unlocked. Like that spiral that we've talked about needs
Right.
to be stopped. So, okay, that's on Ferrari. Let's move on to Alpine, which generally we don't talk a lot about, especially not at this point in a conversation. But there's been a lot that's happened. And I
Oh,
think
yeah.
yeah, like I have so much that I want to say, but so much I won't say because I just don't know that my emotions, because we are recording this as we are getting new information, and I don't want to, in emotion, say more than I think is appropriate.
Yep.
I all I know is I'm really confused, disappointed in watching what seems to be happening. And we've said that before when it's come to Alpine, or at least I've said that before over
Hmm.
other chapters of this saga. And then especially when it comes to someone like Jack, I'm concerned. I don't know because again, we're recording, so we don't know if new information is happening in real time or will be released after we record, but before we release this episode. But all the indicators are that Jack Doohan's going to be released from Alpine. And that really upsets me in the sense that, and I told you this before we hit the record button, we know that Oscar was originally in the lineup for the Alpine world. But through the management and of some experienced Formula One insiders, i.e., Mark Webber and who else might have been a part of that, Oscar was moved into the McLaren world. And now we just talked about McLaren and how Oscar's doing. We're seeing his racing talent on full display in a
Yep.
culture and in a car that is so well suited to him.
Right.
And I look at Jack Doohan's pedigree and what he's done to get here. And I wonder if he's being shortchanged because of what appears to be the culture and process currently or until in recent times happening at Alpine. And it just, because we know how hard it is for racers to get to that position, it just breaks
Hmm.
my heart because I don't want to see talented people wasting that talent because of external factors. But then I also know, learning from you and John, it's a cutthroat industry inside of Formula One, and it is part of the business. And
Yep.
sometimes, and that's part of the risk factor. Like we talked about TPs and their risk assessment as to outlaying money or development efforts. It's also part of the risk that a driver takes as well of trying to ascend this ladder, that it all could come crumbling down on them as well,
Right.
out of their control. So
Yep.
I think that's my most gracious ability to say this without saying any more of my emotional
Hmm.
um, soapbox. You can choose to respond or gently segue us to the closing of this episode. It's your call, Dick.
Well, I've got to talk about Alpine. So,
Okay.
you
Okay.
know, they've produced a pretty good car. Pierre Gasly is certainly showing what that car has in terms of its value. Jack was always under enormous pressure, a big spotlight and magnifying glass put on him the moment Flavio Briatore brought in Franco Colapinto to be a reserve driver. And you're kind of like, yeah, that guy's not going to be a reserve driver for very long. And so I think that the expectation has always been that sooner or later, Jack was going to be replaced. And Oliver Oates at the time did not say anything that would, it was more like what he didn't say than what he did say. He did not control the press well. There has been a lot of controversy swirling around Jack. He had that big crash in Japan that was totally his fault when he forgot to close the DRS going into turn one and caused all sorts of damage. I think that at the end of the day, the move by Briatore to get Oliver Oates replaced as team principal, I think it's fair to say that Franco will be replacing Jack in the next couple of days. That'd be my guess. And given the culture, going back to your point about Oscar going to McLaren, great car, very good culture. And you go to a team like Alpine with a good car and a culture that seems to thrive on chaos. I mean, the team principal role, the technical chiefs, all that kind of stuff. Think about that. It's a revolving door there. And Jack's potential has clearly been masked. You wonder how much of Franco's potential will be masked by that chaos. The only guy who seems to be surviving and thriving is Gasly, and that's because he's already experienced the chaos at Red Bull. And so for him, it's kind of like, different person, but the same person, Same person on the inside looks different on the outside. I think Gasly is proving his worth by thriving in a chaotic environment with a good but not great car. But I worry that we may never see Jack's true potential because of that chaos. And we may not see Franco's. So we'll see. Franco has his work cut out for him.
Yeah,
Yep.
he does. Okay, so that's a bit of a downer to end this episode. So let's find something positive. Otherwise, I think the whole purpose of why we enjoy having these conversations is that it pulls us out of our very active days that are full of very
Right.
hard pressing issues, right? So let's find
Right.
something positive to end. Otherwise, also our audience, I feel like will be like, oh, thanks. That was an hour and you left me on that note. So
Right.
let's go to some positives. I would say is I'm looking forward to Barcelona. I think that that will reset and set the rest of our calendar. And I would say if anybody out there is a new fan and thinking about these races, that they should keep in mind that the rookies are performing better than I think we would have expected, and that these races, these tracks have good variation to provide us with a lot of data. And it really should give us hope that this can be a really good year of racing.
Totally agree with all of that, but I will also add we have a triple header coming up that is Imola, Monaco, Barcelona, and three different tracks, although Imola and Monaco in some respects are very similar in that it is incredibly difficult to pass at both of those places. Monaco, of course, pretty much the crown jewel of Formula One. Always fun to watch qualifying. The race, not so much, but I think it's going to be fun. I think it'll be very interesting to see what happens. And hey, as a Fernando fan, crossing my fingers that they actually bring a real upgrade package to Imola.
Well, let's see. That'll be great. And on the note of Monaco, we have some really fun content that's going to be coming out ahead of the Monaco Grand Prix. So
Oh, yeah.
just putting that plug out there, we're really excited about it. We hope that all of our audience will make sure that they're sharing our information, putting out the podcast because we've got some really exciting things that we are continuing to roll out. And it's really because of our friends out there. They are the reason why we continue to do this and are excited
Yep.
to take this to a whole nother level. We're actually going to, when we get to our next monthly race review, I think we'll be at our 2 year anniversary, Dick, of the
Wow. That's right.
podcast.
That's great.
So that's exciting. And who we didn't think of it, we would be doing, well, we kind of hoped, but you never know if it's going to happen. But I'm excited that we're about to hit that second anniversary. So
Yeah,
thank
that's
you,
a big
Dick.
deal.
Thank you, to John, for this audience that we were able to build that's really turning into a community. So I'm
Yep.
excited and I look forward to this next month and our next
Yeah,
conversation.
I'm looking forward to it too. Super grateful to you, Sabrina, and to John and to our audience and all the great comments that we get. I think my parting shot is, do you want to drop any names about people we might be talking with between now and Monaco, or are you going to leave that as a surprise?
I think we should leave it as a surprise. Now, if somebody wants to message us, we'll be very happy to let them know who it is.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
if anything, you gotta reach out and then you'll get the insider scoop. But we're not gonna give all of that away on the
No, no, no.
public, right?
Yeah, we got to leave them with a cliffhanger.
That's all right. Awesome. Okay, Dick,
Awesome.
we got to get back to our real world.
Yep.
Enjoyed this conversation. Thanks so much.
Likewise. Uh-huh.
Okay, friends, what did you think of our conversation? Drop me a line via email, Sabrina at 2guysagirlandf1.com. Can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. And with that, let me say, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in because we're just 2 guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.